The California Master Plan for Higher Education, developed in 1960, helped create a system of public higher education that has become the envy of the world. But a lot has changed in California colleges since 1960, not the least of which are the increased diversity of the student population, the new ways education can be delivered, the new job skills that are required, and the widening gap between the number of college graduates and the state's workforce needs. All this has left policymakers and experts wondering if California's hallmark Master Plan for Higher Education has outlived its usefulness. Is there a better way for California's three systems of higher education, community colleges, CSUs, and UCs, to meet the challenges of doing more with less while still producing the quality and quantity of college graduates the state will need to compete in a global economy? We'll ask Carole D'Elia, the acting executive director of the Little Hoover Commission, that recently issued a report entitled A New Plan for a New Economy, Reimagining Higher Education, and Nancy Shulock, executive director of the Institute for Higher Education Leadership and Policy at California State University, Sacramento. California's 1960 Master Plan for Higher Education, a new plan for a new economy?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Governor Brown has called on higher education to rein in costs, operate more efficiently, and help students obtain their diplomas more quickly. Recently, the California Little Hoover Commission issued a comprehensive report making recommendations on how those goals might be achieved. We are fortunate to be joined by Carole Delia, the acting executive director of the California Little Hoover Commission. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
Well, listen, first of all, why don't we tell our listeners a little bit about the Little Hoover Commission. Who are you? What do you do?
Okay, the Little Hoover Commission, we're now in our 51st year. We were established through legislation led by Senator Milton Marks and signed into law by Governor Pat Brown back in 1962. Our mission is to find efficiency in economy and government. We're independent, we're bipartisan. We have 13 members, 4 of them are acting members of the legislature, 2 from each party, 2 from each house. And they have the ability to go out and look at different topics in California state government.
So you're looking at recommendations to make state government better, and you focused on, for some reason, California higher education. Why?
Well, it really came down to a concern that was raised by other research groups that California, coming up our economy was not going to be served by enough students who were pursuing higher education.
So there's going to be a big gap, what the needs are versus what the supply of students is going to be?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of reasons maybe for that. One reason might be that it costs too much. But going to college is very expensive, so they just can't afford it. Does it cost too much in California?
Our commission looked at cost in terms of the concern in between 2008 and 2012, when we were in the Great Recession. The California legislature and the governor cut back a lot of areas of government, higher education included. As a result, tuition went up sharply in each of the segments, the community colleges, the CSU, the University of California. In that time period, almost doubled or did double the cost of tuition. At the same time, though, compared to other states, our community colleges are most affordable in the country.
The lowest tuition, I think, in the nation.
Yes. Our California state, if you compare them to comparable universities outside of California, we come in at $1,000 less. And the UCs, if you look at them in terms of other public research universities, are a little bit high. But if you look at top tier public research universities, they come in lower than most. So we didn't really see it as an issue of affordability, but there was concern that with the funding cuts, that we weren't going to be able to sustain our system the way we had in the past.
Is it still a good value? Would you argue that a college education is still a good value in California?
Absolutely. I think our commission found that we have excellent institutions, and it's a great value. The challenge that we found was not so much in how much it costs, but in the challenges that the students were having as far as completion rates.
Okay. You know, there have been numerous attempts. I'm going to transition a little bit to the numerous attempts that have been made to change the master plan for higher education. Here's another set of recommendations. What's different about this set?
Well, we'd like to see it in 2 ways. We feared when we made that sort of a recommendation there might be a little bit of eye rolling given how many attempts have been made to fix the master plan.
I just want to go on the record, I did not roll my eyes.
Okay. But what we see, number one, some of the groups in the past didn't have all the players at the table. So you might have had the legislature taking a lead role and then telling the segments what to do, or you have the segments saying, "This, here's what we're going to do." What we really need is not for any, we don't need a master plan, a new master plan, just for the higher education segment. We need to achieve whatever the goals that the state of California wants out of its higher education system. And we need to focus on those goals and focus on the students. So we think having the right people at the table will make a difference. We also think that this is an important juncture in time where, as I said, we're not going to fund it the way we used to. We also have new things coming, such as online education, and what role could that potentially play? So we're optimistic that this time thoughtful leaders will come together and will make progress.
You know, there's another interesting change that's occurring, and that is each one of those systems, the community college, CSU, and UC, have new leaders. So
correct.
There's an opportunity there as well. I want to ask you about the hearings you've been holding for a number of years, since 2011, on challenges in higher education. What are some of the problems you found?
Well, the biggest problem we found is, again, going back, that our economy needs a more educated workforce. There was data that was presented to us that in 2025, we need 2.3 million more educated, that being students who obtain a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, a certificate, educated in a broad sense. And so that was the overarching problem that we saw. Underneath that, we saw students having difficulty getting the courses they need to get in and out. So again, back to the value and affordability. If you're able to get through in 4 years, it can be affordable. But if you can't get your classes and you're taking up a spot, taking a class that you don't really need just to stay in the system, clogging the system for those behind you. So unless we figure out how to eliminate some of the bottlenecks, we saw that as a challenge. We saw a challenge as a lot of disadvantaged students not coming to college prepared, not completing. So those were some of the issues we saw that we thought needed to be addressed.
Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about some of the recommendations of Little Hoover Commission. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Carole Delia, Acting Executive Director of Little Hoover Commission, about a report they recently issued entitled A New Plan for a New Economy, Reimagining Higher Education. Well, you say in your report that, quote, "It's time to declare that the master plan is obsolete and call for a new master plan," unquote. Why, in your opinion, is the master plan no longer relevant?
Well, what we found, we heard from several experts at our public hearings, and what we found were basically 3 key things. One, we talked about a little bit already, and that is that we're not funding higher ed the way it was envisioned in the master plan. The master plan was developed in 1960. It was meant to be a 15-year plan. We're now 50 years out. So in addition to funding, the other 2 challenges that we face is a significantly different demographic. In the 1960s, we had a predominantly white population. Now we're multi-ethnic, and many of those ethnicities are a larger part of the demographic, but aren't a larger part of higher ed. And so that's a challenge we need to overcome.
Latinos specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
The other 3rd challenge is that our K-12 is not being funded at the same level as a comparison to the rest of the United States. And what we were told is students are arriving at college not ready for college.
Okay, so those are all problems. So what are the goals then of a new master plan? What should the goals be, given those 3 changes?
Well, the broad goal, again, I hate to continue to repeat myself, but it's to have a more educated workforce. It's to have more students achieve, whether it's a degree or certificate. It's to get people from disadvantaged backgrounds to not just participate in higher ed, but to complete. It's to get students through quicker in an appropriate amount of time where appropriate, particularly if it's a full-time student. I mean, we understand that there are many part-time students who have other obligations, and for them it's going to be a slower path. We want to continue to have access for everyone, and we want to guarantee that it's affordable. And finally, we want our programs that are being offered to match the needs of the California economy as well as our civic needs.
So how do you bring all this together with folks at the table? Who should be at the table to talk about all these issues?
Well, again, we see a broader group at the table determining the new master plan. Again, looking at what are the needs of California and what are the needs of the student. So you would have students, you'd have alumni, you'd have civic organizations, you'd have local government, you'd have business, you'd have economic development folks.
So this isn't going to be just a faculty committee talking about this.
But the higher ed segment's all at the table as well. It needs to be a broader conversation.
You know, something interesting you pointed out in your report about funding, and that is linking it to goals. You refer to this thing called performance-based funding. How would that work?
Well, performance-based funding is any time you basically reward an organization for achieving the goals that you've laid out. So in our 2012 Community College report, which this report builds on, we specifically said you would take a specific pot of money, you would put it at the chancellor's office, and you would establish certain goals, whether it be improving completion or you're measuring growth in serving disadvantaged students, whatever you determine your metrics are going to be, and then you use that to reward for achieving those goals.
You'd pay more to the universities or colleges in terms of funding. I want to ask you, though, one of the questions that people bring up all the time is that, gee, if we are focused on completion rates, that's just going to, and we tie funding to it, we're just going to encourage universities and colleges to become degree mills. Just lower standards and get people out the door, show, hey, we have a high completion rate to get more funding. Is there a concern there?
There could be a concern, but what we envisioned, again, our commission flies at 30,000 feet. We try not to get in the weeds and say, here's what the metrics should be. We really see a role in the higher ed segments. You know, the legislature and the policymakers say, here's what our goals are, and give the segments the opportunity to say, here's how we're going to get there. Have them have a role in designing it so then they can be held accountable. So hopefully we don't have that sort of a degree mill problem.
You know, the other thing you mentioned, which is big in your report, and that is online education. You refer to it as transformational. How does it differ, though, than the traditional distance learning programs we've seen in the past?
Well, online, and it has a lot of different variations. It really isn't all that different from distance learning. I'll focus on some of the areas where it is. Obviously, you have students who are accessing course material through the internet. They have the opportunity to go online and instantaneous access materials. They get to hear from people that they otherwise might not hear from. But it does have, in most cases, the traditional, whether it's via telephone or whether it's in-person meetings or whether they listen to lectures online and then meet in a classroom. It has different, and it can, in an ideal form, have different elements than just straight distance learning.
So yeah, so it's very, very broad, lots of things under that umbrella. But when we come back, we're going to talk about a model program in one California city that could be replicated statewide, perhaps even in places like Fresno and Bakersfield. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Carole Delia from the Little Hoover Commission about a report they recently issued on higher education in California. You cite an example of cooperation between a high school, a community college, and a CSU in Long Beach. What did they do that was so interesting?
Well, the Long Beach Promise, as it's called, is a fascinating collaboration between three different segments of the education system. What happened was you had a school district come together with a community college, come together with CSU Long Beach, and basically established a promise to the students of Long Beach Unified School District that if they want a spot at college, it's there and waiting for them. So it's a promise that there is a college education waiting for them.
Does that include paying for it or just a spot if you meet these criteria?
Well, in one sense, it actually is paying for it. At the community college level, the students are guaranteed their first semester will be paid for by a Long Beach foundation. As far as CSU Long Beach, what's guaranteed is if they meet all of the criteria for entrance into a California State University, that they're guaranteed a spot at CSU Long Beach.
I think a lot of people don't understand that Cal States generally have a service area that they're responsible for. So Long Beach, Cal State Long Beach is trying to serve the Long Beach area, or Cal State Fresno is trying to serve the Fresno area. They worked on a number of things you were talking about in this promise. What areas specifically did they work on? I know I read something about teacher preparedness and training. What are the other things that they did?
Well, they started out looking at how do we make our high school students ready for college coursework. And they looked at curriculum. And so then they expanded and went back. They actually go down as all the way to 4th and 5th graders and introduce them to the concept. They come to the campus, they talk about City College, they talk about Long Beach, the kids go on field trips. So it's preparing them mentally that they're on a path that could potentially lead to college. So potentially students whose families may not think of them as college material. And then it's taking, holding them accountable, sharing the data, which is a really amazing aspect. They're able to look at the students coming out when they're placed in City College or when they're placed at Long Beach, to then go back and say, hey, these students weren't prepared, and go drilling back all the way to the classroom.
So they track it all the way back to the classroom and the teacher they had in grade school or junior high or high school to see how they were doing, and then they can maybe predict their success down the line, possibly, and make changes where necessary.
Exactly. It's more about making changes as far as then going back and helping whatever the teacher or whichever school maybe needs something additional. But then it goes the other way as well. So you have Long Beach City Unified saying to CSU Long Beach, hey, we need teachers who are able to achieve the results you want. And so it's a loop of information.
So it's a feedback loop going both ways,
yes,
from the high school and also to the universities. That's really interesting. What about the results? So how did it work?
Well, they have been working on this since the early 90s. It was in response to the defense industry going away and the leaders wanting to have a vibrant community. They officially launched Long Beach Promise in 2008, so the data is really new, but what they've found so far between 2008 and 2012, that Long Beach City Unified freshmen have increased attendance at CSU Long Beach by 43%. Another notable distinction is how they place students. Rather than relying simply on test scores, they actually look at how they were doing in the classroom. So you have them being placed in college-level English courses. The completion success rate has grown 500%.
Wow.
As far as college-level math, it's grown 200%.
That's pretty amazing, because a large number of students who even attend Cal States need to take remedial courses in math and English. So this is a dramatic improvement.
It is. It's a great concept, and they're seeing significant results in the Latino and African American population. So it's something that other communities who have, obviously a community college and a CSU in them should really be looking at and thinking about replicating.
So Fresno, Bakersfield, are you listening? But people say, listen, towns like Bakersfield and Fresno are very different than Long Beach. What would be your response to that?
Well, what it takes is leadership. What worked in Long Beach is you had individuals from each of those segments who came together and wanted to work together. So that leadership, it is hard to replicate. But if you have officials who are in the position and are willing to work together, and Long Beach is a model, you can take what they've done and adapt it for the needs of Bakersfield's Fresno.
Yeah, it also was interesting that I read that Long Beach surprisingly has 70% of their children on free or reduced price meal programs. So it's not a wealthy school district by any means.
No.
One last question, that is about oversight. In 2011, Governor Brown did away with this thing called the California Post-Secondary Education Commission to save money, and he said it really wasn't that effective. He did, however, urge higher ed stakeholders to find new approaches to oversight. But here's the question. We already have a board of trustees at the different levels, community college, CSU, UC. Is an oversight body really needed, another one?
What our commission felt, and many people agreed with Governor Brown, that the former commission was not effective as designed. But at the same time, you don't have any overarching body left in California that will ensure that the data you're getting is compatible, that will ensure that the segments are working together to continue to make transfers more seamless than they are. So there really does need to be an overarching body.
So we don't have silos of the community colleges, CSU, and UCs. Well, I want to thank Carole D'Elia from the Little Hoover Commission for joining us. Up next, an expert in higher education talks about her take on the impact of the Little Hoover Commission's report. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. What's the likely impact, some might say fallout, of Little Hoover Commission report recently issued on higher education? Our guest is Nancy Shulock, Executive Director of the Institute for Higher Education, Leadership, and Policy at California State University, Sacramento. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, the Little Hoover Commission is calling for a new master plan for higher education. Others, like your institute and the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, are calling for a public agenda. What's the difference?
You know, there's a really important difference. It's subtle, but I think it's very important. The master plan really is about institutions. It's about funding and maintaining institutions. It was, everybody knows it's old. It was from 1960, and the big challenge of the time then was how to deal with this oncoming onslaught of growth. It was, higher education was changing from an elite enterprise to something that served the majority of Americans, and Californians in this case. So the master plan set up 3 segments that we know, community colleges, CSU, UC, and it's really been first and foremost about funding and maintaining institutions and focused on the differences and the boundaries and the separations. And so my concern, and those of many whom I work with, is that we should really get rid of that word. The Little Hoover Commission has done a great service by bringing all these issues to the fore. What I think we need is a public agenda that puts the public first. So it just starts in a different place. It starts with what do Californians need from higher education? And then it works to what do they need, and what do they need from these institutions? What might they need from different kinds of institutions that we may not have yet? Or how can these institutions work together to cross those boundaries to get rid of some of that rigidity to really serve Californians? So it's just a shift, putting the public first rather than institutions.
Kind of along the same lines, the Little Hoover Commission refers to the governor and the legislature drafting a plan. Does that happen in other states? How does that normally work?
So that's really the crux of the issue. Other states, and we're studying this right now, a number of other states, 10, 12, 15 other states have public agendas. But they have something that we don't have that has allowed that to happen. They have infrastructures, they have professionals whose job it is to be thoughtful and work on these kinds of issues, to take data, to analyze it, to work with stakeholders, to learn what's happening nationally, and to then develop a plan, vet it with stakeholders, and then get it adopted by lawmakers. We don't have that in California. So I think this is kind of what's happened in the past reviews of the master plan. We've had all the right people in the room and the stakeholders, but then there isn't an executive branch entity to really take it and make it, get it across the finish line, and then implement it and monitor it. It's not a matter of just developing a plan and then having the plan implement itself. So the challenge, and a lot of people are working on this and thinking about this, is what kind of entity and process and structure can we get in California to make these good things happen? You know,
a new plan would probably avoid some of the piecemeal approach that the Little Hoover Commission criticized. How could you build a plan that would do that?
Well, I think it comes back to the issue of not focusing on 3 institutions. We've had a history of policy making in California higher education that's really what are we going to do with the community colleges? What can we do with the state university? What can we do with UC?
But that started because each of those were kind of in some ways in their infancy at that point. They're trying to figure out their lines back in 1960, but now those lines have become more almost ossified.
Right, exactly.
Right, so it's a different scenario now.
So if we had a public agenda, it could address the kinds of issues that cross boundaries. Mm-hmm. It could help us deal with some of the really essential interface with K-12 to deal with the huge problems of college and career readiness. It could deal with transfer in a better way, where transfer of credit. It could deal with adults who are not enrolled in any of our 3 sets of institutions and need to be brought back in or need training. It could help us address issues of the performance gap and how we close it. It just
and the performance gap is?
The performance gap between subgroups of population. So we have Latinos, African American students going to inferior public schools, so being less well prepared, needing remediation, having lower college enrollment rates and lower college completion rates. That's the gap.
Is online education one of the ways to deal with that remediation? I mean, to bring education to the masses? Is that the answer, online education?
It is not the answer. It's obviously something that's going to have to be incorporated into any planning moving forward. But there's been some research recently that shows that the kinds of disadvantaged populations that we have to be especially concerned about educating in California have not done well with online learning.
It's less expensive, but not necessarily as efficient with those populations?
I don't know that it's less expensive. You know, there are a lot of costs. I'm not denigrating it. It's obviously very powerful. But I think, first of all, we need to make a distinction between delivering instruction to far distances and the vast potential that it has for learning, to improve learning with digital content. And so I think if you can have more blended kinds of classrooms and the new concept of flipped classrooms where students can watch lectures and then come in a new faculty role of really engaging students, but just having students who may not even own computers, I think it's not the answer.
It might be a problem. Well, thank you very much, Professor Nancy Shulock with the Institute for Higher Education Leadership and Policy at Cal State Sacramento. We'd also like to thank Carole D'Elia with the Little Hoover Commission for joining us. If you want to stay current on public policy, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS.
This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.